Planning your podcast interviews helps to host interesting conversations that bring listeners back to your podcast and make them want to share your episodes. But there's much more than just sit with a person and talk about anything. In this video, I'll show you the whole system I use for hosting the podcast interviews and a step-by-step process of how to plan podcast interview questions. Hi, my name is Marina Baraeva, and on this channel we'll talk about how to grow your business and personal brand. Talking about the podcast interviews. When my guests say yes to an interview, they get two things. A link to a scheduling system where they can pick a suitable time for them, and the questions for the interview that we might cover. And here's why. When you plan a podcast interview, you want it to actually happen. I schedule guests all around the world in different time zones. A scheduling system converts the right time for both sides. I use Acuity scheduling system, which I link to the description below so you can check it out, which allows me to pick the time where I plan to host my interviews, and I also set up the notifications that everybody gets after scheduling. My guests get several emails. One after they pick the time, the confirmation email. Then they get one email a day before our interview and 1 hour before our interview. In every email, they have the time of the interview and my Skype name. The thing is that even if I tell everything in the first email or upfront, this is my Skype name, people can come up with me the last moment asking, where are we going to host the interview? Remind them about it, even if it's so simple information. Set everything so they will just check and know what they need to know and then come prepared for the interview. And also, I record every interview with Skype because I have the recording system set up there. Then the second thing I mentioned, after a person says yes for a podcast interview, they get an Evernote link with these details. For example, this is the note which got Christina Pater. And in the note, I don't have this part. I have the top bio and introduction, which I usually record after we finish the episode because I want to include some details from the interview and make it more interesting for people to know what they're going to expect in our conversation. And when people fill the information in the Acuity scheduling system, they include their bio. So I copy and paste it here and then I write my short intro. So if you listen to the Marketing for Creatives podcast, you'll find that it starts with an intro music, then my regular speech, that this is me, welcome to the Marketing for Creatives show, and then a short intro to the episode. And then this is the part of the bio which I copied and pasted from the Acuity scheduling system. So when they get this note, when my guests get this note, they don't have this part. I include a letter after they schedule the interview. Then they get the topic. Sometimes it can be one, sometimes it can be several. I include there the titles which I think would be great for this episode. As you see, the main one is how to write a TED Talk. And then I can come up with a little more compelling title that will make listeners to click when they see the episode in the podcast application. So here they see the exact topic, which I already finalized, and I know that the episode is going to be with this. Or like in this case, I got several ideas and I didn't decide which one to choose. I will decide that later when we already record the episode, and it will be somewhere before publishing. But as you see, the main idea how to write a TED Talk is already here. I just change a little bit. Then I tell them about the audience so they know who they should focus on. I usually include that into the email which I send to the guests when I pitch them an invite for the interview. I tell them a little bit about the audience already so they know who they will speak to. But here again, you don't know in how many weeks, month. Yes, it may happen that you may need to wait for several months until you have the interview with the guest. So here, I include this information that they may check if they want to look at the questions before the interview. And then I have the questions. Here is the main structure for all my episodes. It starts with the entrepreneurial story I'm looking for, bringing why they do what they do, my guests, how they got to where they are right now, their story. And then I list the questions which I may ask them. Some of them I may even write word by word the way I will say that. Sometimes I read them, sometimes I just try to change a little bit and adjust it to what the person told right away. So that will sound more like a conversation, even if I thought about the question and even if I wrote the long sentences, the long questions here in my notes. You can listen to our conversation with Christina in the podcast episode or in this video, where is the online version which I posted on YouTube. I'll put all the links into the descriptions below. So you can look at the questions which I have in the Evernote and then listen to the episode and compare how I said it and what else I added there. When I think about the questions, I look for the person's story, their experience, the practical tips that might be useful for my audience. Before I launched the Marketing for Creatives show, I decided that I want to make it practical, some kind of how-to podcast. So people would listen to the episode, take some ideas from there and apply to their business and life, and then get some results in like very short period of time. That's why after the episode, I ask my people, my guests, what are the 3 tips that you would recommend to our listeners to try so they would get the results within, let's say, next month. And when I talk to people, I start with that story and then I transition to the practical experience and practical tips. But this is my approach. If you host an episode that is based on the person's story, then your goal as a host to dig deep into it, do your research. The most interesting stories are those that show people from unusual for the publicity side. The worst thing you can do is to come up with the general questions that they already covered many times on other media. Ask what, where, why, how, when questions. Those are the magic questions which will save you in any situation. Let's say you did your research and you found some interesting facts that you may get a little deeper into that. So you write this question like, what happened then? Where it happened? How it happened? Why did you choose this or that? What are your ups and downs? Those are the things which let people think about the question and answer with the story. The worst thing can happen if you ask them the question which will be yes or no. Sometimes I use this when my guests talk for a while already and I ask them another question, but they share the whole story. So in the end, I want to do a little summary of what they say and make it a little bit more clear for my listeners. So I can tell a few sentences like this, is that right? And then they can say yes. Some guests may even keep talking after that, but some can say just right. And that's it. And then you ask your next question. But try to avoid those yes or no questions when you want to cover the story. Ask what happened when you start your business? What happened when you lost your business? How did you recover after that? And then you can encourage people to tell more about those details. Now, I understand that maybe you didn't conduct the interviews so often and you need some sort of experience, but there's a trick which will help you to use those key questions, key phrases, and ask an interesting question. So listen to a guest, you ask your first question, and then you listen to the answer. And pay attention to what people say and how they say. And when you feel that there's something that important to them, you use your what, where, when, why, how questions about this particular part which you want to discover more about. if I would say, for example, I started my business at 25 and then went traveling all the world and then blah, blah, blah. Why did you decide to go travel the world after you started your business? You see? Simple thing. And then you can hear another story. Well, I decided to travel around the world because I wanted to see all the continents or meet new people or whatever. And then you ask, where did you meet new people? Oh, I met new people in the US, in Argentina, and so on. So find that key phrase or key word which people tell about, especially when they tell about with the passion. You will see that in their eyes if you do the video interview, or you will hear in their voice, because you just know, you will know that the person is passionate about the topic and this is valuable for them. And then get a little deeper in that and discover that story. But let's get back to our Evernote. So we list the questions there. I know for my 30-35 minutes interview, I can have maximum of 10 questions. Often we don't cover them all. Even in the beginning of the interview or in the email, I tell my guests that here are the questions that we may cover in the interview, but that's okay if we will not cover them all, because that's going to be the conversation, and maybe I can ask you some additional questions just depending on what you answer, because I don't know what they're going to tell me. I can guess and I can assume what can be the next step in the conversation, but sometimes they start sharing the story or telling the tips which I want to discover more about, because I think that will be useful and practical for the listeners. So that's okay if you will not cover them all. And no more than 10, because usually if you have more than 10 questions, it's like the maximum you can cover. Often it's maybe 6 questions, depends how people talk. Some people like to talk a lot. Some people answer with the very short phrases. Like, keep in mind all of these new nuances, all of these small things. The more interviews you have, the more you will realize what is suitable for you, what works for your guests, and then you will adjust that. And if you look for interesting guests to interview on your podcast, watch this video where I'll show you how to find enough guests to fill several months of your podcast schedule. And from there, you can start sending them emails and your questions. Here's the thing. Some people who I send the questions say like, I don't need the questions, I know them. And that can be fine. But also I got the replies that people say, wow, thank you for sending me that. You're so organized. Even well-known people told me that all the process I do is very organized. And it's very helpful for them to see those questions before, because you can cover a lot of things. If I'm an expert, I can talk about so many things, and I prefer that you would tell me a little bit kind of the direction of our conversation, so I would think about this, about the value I can bring to people. Now, even if your guests do not need those questions, that's totally fine. They will be useful for you. Sometimes you schedule the interview, and the interview itself will be maybe like in 2 months or in 3 months. It happens. Or it may be later evening or early morning. I had the interviews at 6 a.m. I had the interviews at 2 a.m. because I live on the opposite side of the world from my guests. And at this time, it's just difficult to concentrate. Like, you just think, Marina, do not close your eyes, otherwise you can fall asleep during the interview. It's very difficult to keep your mind fresh while your guest is just talking and sharing their tips. So those questions will help you to stay organized, and even if you forget something or just falling asleep or tired and losing the idea of the conversation, you will know exactly what to ask, or maybe even to say if you want to write the phrase as I've done, and you will still have the interesting interview. Because when you're tired, your brain starts slowed down a little bit, and it might be difficult to come up with the interesting question that moment. But when you have those questions listed, you know that you can ask this question. If you come up with another one while you're guest talking, that's fine too. To find these questions, I search on my person website or their LinkedIn page. Sometimes I check the information on the internet. I can Google for the other interviews, for the book. Often I go to the speakers page if I interview a speaker or those who do the workshops, because they list the topics which they specialize in, and they list the questions which I may ask, or they list the achievements, the results which people get, and based on that, I can ask some more details on those topics. Those are very helpful, and it gives you more information on the topic which you're not that familiar with. If I would tomorrow want to interview someone about AI in marketing, I don't know anything about this. I will need to Google and then to come up with the questions. If I will need to interview someone about Instagram marketing, I can come up with the questions right away. So think about this. If you need to do your research, well, you better do research for every guest, but how deep you need to make it, and write those questions. Then in the end, I prefer to ask my guests, what are your 3 tips to our listeners so they can apply it? Some people do the roundup questions. Okay, we finished the conversation. Now I ask you 5 questions and you need to answer first. Or you can ask about the biggest piece of advice they can give to you, your listeners. Come up with something how you can kind of end the conversation. So that will be something, the bonus, maybe a bonus tip for your listeners. And the last one, you share how people can find your guest, or you can include some of promotions from your guests. You can add your promotions, just mix this up. Usually, I allow my guests to promote any of their free courses or their books or upcoming events, whatever they want. And one more important thing, when you have the interview, try to speak less than your guest. It's an interview. It's about your guest, not you talking. Sometimes you listen to the show and the host seems like knows more than the guest who he or she interviews. Try to avoid that. I've heard from many listeners that they don't like that part. Or if you feel that you want something to say, if that will be valuable for your listeners within a few sentences or with a little story, but then ask the question and let your guests talk. And if you're serious about your podcast, I recommend you to check this video where I share more podcasting tips that will be useful for you. Now please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you'll get more videos like this.